My name is Sadie Thomson, and I'm 62 years old. For the past 3 years, I've been living quietly in my colonial home in Riverside Hills, thinking my biggest worry would be tending to my late husband's rose garden. I never imagined that my age would become a weapon used against me by people young enough to be my children. They called me the old lady, with such contempt, believing they could push me out of my own neighborhood. What they didn't know was that this old lady had spent 30 years as a federal prosecutor, and I was about to remind them that experience beats arrogance every single time. Before I tell you what happened that day, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button if you've ever been underestimated because of your age, and don't forget to subscribe, because this story will show you why appearances can be deceiving. 3 years ago, when my husband Robert passed away from cancer, I thought the hardest part of my life was behind me. We'd shared 41 years together in our beautiful 2-story colonial home on Maple Street, right here in Riverside Hills, Phoenix, Arizona. The house felt enormous without his laughter echoing through the halls, but I was determined to maintain the life we'd built together. For 3 decades, I'd worked as a federal prosecutor, handling everything from white-collar crime to organized crime cases. I'd put away embezzlers, con artists, and corrupt officials who thought they were untouchable. After retiring 5 years ago, I'd been looking forward to a peaceful life with Robert tending our garden and maybe traveling a bit. Life had other plans. Riverside Hills used to be a close-knit community where neighbors knew each other's names and helped during tough times. The Homeowners Association was run by longtime residents who understood that rules existed to maintain property values, not to control every aspect of people's lives. Mrs. Patterson, who'd been HOA president for 15 years, always made decisions with fairness and common sense. But demographics were shifting. Young tech executives and corporate lawyers were buying up properties drawn by our excellent schools and proximity to downtown Phoenix. These weren't bad people, but they brought different ideas about community management. They wanted efficiency, modernization, and what they called forward-thinking leadership. I first noticed the change during my evening walks around the neighborhood. Where once I'd receive friendly waves and invitations to chat over garden fences, now I encountered polite but distant nods. Young families would quickly usher their children inside when I approached. It wasn't overtly hostile, just cold. The shift became official last spring when Mrs. Patterson announced her resignation due to health issues. The timing coincided with several longtime residents moving away to be closer to grandchildren or assisted living facilities. Suddenly, our community meetings were dominated by newcomers discussing outdated management styles and the need for fresh perspectives. I should have seen what was coming when Brandon Hartwell threw his hat into the ring for HOA president. At 35, he was a successful software company director with an MBA and boundless confidence in his ability to optimize community operations. His running mate, Jessica Manning, was a sharp-tongued corporate lawyer who specialized in contract negotiations and had zero patience for what she called inefficient processes. Their campaign focused on modernization, increased property values, and streamlined decision-making. They promised to eliminate bureaucratic delays and implement data-driven community management. To younger residents, this sounded progressive and exciting. To those of us who'd lived here for decades, it felt like a hostile takeover. The election wasn't even close. Brandon and Jessica won by a landslide, carried by the votes of residents who'd lived here less than 3 years. During their victory speech at the community center, I watched from the back row as they outlined their vision for Riverside Hills 2.0. The language was corporate polished and completely devoid of the warmth that had once defined our neighborhood. What troubled me most wasn't their youth or their business background. It was the way they looked at longtime residents like we were obstacles to progress rather than stakeholders in the community. When Mrs. Patterson tried to share some insights about previous challenges during the transition meeting, Brandon cut her off with a patronizing smile, saying, "We appreciate your historical perspective, but we're focused on future solutions." That night, I sat in my kitchen looking out at Robert's rose garden, feeling like a stranger in my own neighborhood. I'd prosecuted enough cases involving abuse of power to recognize the early warning signs. What I couldn't have predicted was how personal their campaign against traditional residents would become, or how viciously they'd target anyone who dared to question their authority. The first official communication from our new HOA board arrived on a Tuesday morning in June. The envelope was thick, professionally printed, and bore the new Riverside Hills logo featuring geometric shapes in trendy gray and teal. Inside was a 23-page document titled Community Standards and Modernization Guidelines, which immediately replaced our previous 4-page neighborhood covenant. I poured myself coffee and settled into Robert's old reading chair to review the changes. What I found made my prosecutor instincts kick into high gear. These weren't reasonable updates to existing rules. They were fundamental alterations to how our community functioned, implemented without proper resident input or legal review. The landscaping section alone was revolutionary. Traditional flower gardens were now classified as non-compliant vegetation and had to be replaced with drought-resistant, architecturally appropriate plantings within 90 days. This directly targeted Robert's prize-winning rose garden, which I'd maintained as a memorial to our life together. Roses weren't considered architecturally appropriate under the new desert modern aesthetic Brandon and Jessica favored. Paint colors were restricted to a palette of 5 shades, 2 variations of gray, 2 of beige, and bright white. Homes with traditional colors like our warm yellow with white trim were given 60 days to repaint or face daily fines of $50. The cost of repainting our large colonial would easily exceed $8,000. Most disturbing was the new Community Harmony Guidelines section, which gave the board broad discretionary power to address behaviors and attitudes that conflict with the forward progress of neighborhood development. The language was deliberately vague, essentially allowing Brandon and Jessica to target anyone they deemed problematic without specific justification. I immediately drafted a respectful letter requesting clarification on several points and suggesting a community forum to discuss the changes before implementation. I hand-delivered it to Brandon's house that afternoon, maintaining the courtesy that had always characterized neighborhood interactions. His response arrived 3 days later, a brief email that felt like a form letter. Thank you for your feedback. The board has carefully considered all aspects of these necessary updates. Implementation will proceed as scheduled. We encourage all residents to embrace positive change. No answers to my specific questions, no acknowledgement of my decades of legal experience, no invitation for dialogue. That weekend, I attended my first HOA meeting under the new leadership. The community center buzzed with conversation as longtime residents shared their concerns about the sudden changes. Mrs. Chen from Elm Street worried about the cost of replacing her beautiful Japanese maple trees. The Johnsons from Oak Drive questioned the legality of such sweeping changes without proper notice periods. When Brandon called the meeting to order, he opened with a presentation about elevating our community brand and maximizing investment returns. Jessica followed with a legal overview emphasizing the board's authority to implement changes they deemed necessary for community welfare. The tone was professional, but dismissive, treating residents like shareholders who needed to be managed rather than neighbors with legitimate concerns. During the public comment period, I stood to address the landscaping requirements and their impact on established gardens that represented significant emotional and financial investments. I'd barely introduced myself when Brandon interrupted with a tight smile. Thank you, Mrs. Thomson. I think we all appreciate your perspective. However, we need to focus on solutions that move our community forward rather than dwelling on past approaches that may no longer serve our evolving needs. The dismissal was polite, but unmistakable. Around the room, I caught several eye rolls and knowing glances between newer residents. Someone behind me whispered, "Finally, leadership that won't get bogged down in endless debate." The message was clear. My input wasn't welcome in their vision of community progress. Walking home that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my early days as a young prosecutor, facing seasoned defense attorneys. I was being underestimated, dismissed as irrelevant because of my age and appearance. The difference was that back then, I'd had the courtroom to prove my worth. Here I was, just another seasoned resident, standing in the way of modernization. But if there's one thing 30 years of prosecuting criminals taught me, it's that people who abuse power rarely stop at minor infractions. They escalate, believing their authority makes them untouchable. Brandon and Jessica had just shown me who they really were, Now I needed to decide what I was going to do about it. The escalation began with my roses. On a sweltering July morning, I was awakened by the sound of heavy machinery in my front yard. Through the bedroom window, I watched 3 men in Riverside Hills maintenance uniforms systematically destroying Robert's Memorial Rose Garden with shovels and a small excavator. I threw on a robe and rushed outside, my heart pounding with disbelief and fury. "Stop! What do you think you're doing? This is private property." The crew supervisor, a weathered man who wouldn't meet my eyes, held up an official work order. "Sorry, ma'am. We're just following instructions from the HOA board. Says here these plants are non-compliant and need immediate removal." "There was no final notice. The 90-day period hasn't even expired," I protested, but they continued working with mechanical efficiency. 23 years of careful cultivation, Robert's pride and joy, reduced to a pile of destroyed stems and uprooted soil in less than an hour. As the crew finished loading their truck, Brandon's silver BMW pulled into his driveway across the street. He emerged in his typical business casual uniform, checking his phone with the casual indifference of someone reviewing weather reports. When he noticed my distress, he approached with what I can only describe as performative concern. "Mrs. Thompson, I heard there might be some confusion about the landscaping timeline." His tone carried the patronizing patience typically reserved for children or the elderly. "I know change can be difficult, but we're all working together to improve property values for everyone's benefit." "You had no right to destroy my garden without proper notice," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite my overwhelming anger. The legal requirement for HOA actions like this includes specific notification procedures and appeal periods. Brandon exchanged a look with Jessica, who had materialized beside him like a well-dressed vulture. She was immaculately put together, even at 8 in the morning, her blonde hair perfectly styled, and her expression radiating the kind of cold amusement lawyers display when facing an opponent they consider outmatched. "Ma'am," Jessica interjected with silky condescension, "I think there might be some misunderstanding about current HOA law. The board has broad discretionary authority to address immediate compliance issues when they impact overall community standards." She spoke slowly, as if explaining complex concepts to someone of limited comprehension. "I understand HOA law perfectly well," I responded firmly. "I also understand proper legal procedures which weren't followed here." Brandon's smile became more strained. "Mrs. Thompson, we certainly appreciate your experience with these matters, but community management has evolved significantly in recent years. Maybe the handbook wasn't entirely clear for someone who might not be familiar with modern administrative practices." The insult was wrapped in polite language, but it landed exactly as intended. They were positioning me as a confused elderly woman who simply didn't understand how things worked anymore. Around us, several neighbors had emerged from their homes to watch the confrontation, and I could see the mixture of sympathy and embarrassment on their faces. "We understand this transition can be challenging for long-term residents," Jessica added with false warmth. "Change can be particularly difficult for seasoned community members who are used to older ways of doing things." That phrase, "seasoned community members," dripped with such calculated condescension that I actually felt my prosecutor instincts sharpen. These two were skilled at verbal manipulation, using age as a weapon, while maintaining plausible deniability about their discriminatory intent. The situation deteriorated further at that month's HOA meeting. I arrived prepared with printed copies of state statutes regarding HOA notification requirements and proper procedures for implementing major policy changes. I'd highlighted the specific sections that Brandon and Jessica had violated and brought documentation showing the timeline discrepancies in their actions. When the public comment period opened, I stood with my materials organized and ready. I'd like to address several procedural violations in the recent landscaping enforcement actions. I began, but Brandon immediately held up his hand. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to stop you right there." His interruption was smooth but firm, designed to maintain control while appearing reasonable. "We've already addressed your concerns about the timeline, and frankly, we need to move forward with more constructive discussions. This meeting is for solutions, not complaints about decisions that have already been properly implemented." "But the legal requirements weren't met," I persisted, holding up my documentation. "State law clearly specifies." "I think we've heard enough outdated perspectives for today." Brandon cut me off again, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure everyone heard the dismissal. Around the room, several newer residents nodded approvingly, as if he'd finally dealt with a persistent disruption. Jessica leaned forward in her chair with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Perhaps we should focus on input from residents who are more aligned with current community development goals." The pause before aligned was deliberate, creating space for the audience to fill in their own interpretations about my relevance to modern community management. A young father in the third row, someone I didn't recognize who'd moved in just months earlier, raised his hand. "I think it's time for the old guard to step aside and let people with fresh ideas lead our community into the future." His comment generated enthusiastic applause from the newer residents, while longtime neighbors sat in uncomfortable silence. The humiliation was calculated and effective. I was being publicly characterized as an obstacle to progress, a relic from an outdated era who couldn't understand modern community management. Brandon and Jessica had successfully positioned my legitimate legal concerns as the confused ramblings of an elderly woman who simply couldn't adapt to change. Walking home that night, I realized I was dealing with something more sophisticated than typical HOA power trips. These two had created a narrative that made questioning their authority seem inherently unreasonable. They'd weaponized my age and experience against me, turning my qualifications into liabilities in the eyes of residents who wanted to believe in their promises of modernization. But they'd also made a critical mistake that every criminal I'd ever prosecuted eventually made. They'd gotten comfortable with their power and started believing their own narrative about being untouchable. In their arrogance, they'd begun operating with the assumption that no one could challenge their authority effectively. What they didn't know was that while they were busy dismissing me as a harmless old lady, I was already building a case that would destroy everything they'd worked to create. My 30 years as a federal prosecutor hadn't made me outdated. They'd made me very, very dangerous to people who believed they were above the law. August brought the community modernization celebration, Brandon and Jessica's crowning achievement in reshaping Riverside Hills according to their vision. The event was scheduled for the first Saturday of the month, right in the common area directly across from my house, with professional catering, a DJ, and speeches celebrating our journey toward community excellence. What made the celebration particularly cruel was that I wasn't invited. The exclusion was deliberate and obvious since invitations had been hand-delivered to every other house on my street. When I checked my mailbox that morning, hoping there'd been some oversight, I found instead a formal notice informing me that my property was under review for ongoing compliance issues and that my presence at community events might be temporarily inappropriate pending resolution of outstanding matters. The psychological warfare was masterful. They'd positioned me as the neighborhood pariah while celebrating everything I was supposedly holding back. From my living room window, I could see families arriving with children in tow, longtime neighbors I'd known for years, mingling uncomfortably with newer residents who seemed genuinely excited about the festivities. Brandon had set up a small stage near the gazebo, and the sound system ensured that every word of his opening remarks carried clearly across the street to my house. "Welcome, everyone, to a celebration of our community's bright future." His voice boomed with practiced enthusiasm. "Today, we're not just celebrating our progress, we're celebrating our freedom from backward-thinking obstacles that have held Riverside Hills back for too long." The crowd applauded enthusiastically, particularly the newer families who saw Brandon and Jessica as visionary leaders rather than the power-hungry manipulators I knew them to be. I watched from my front window as my own neighbors' people I'd helped during emergencies and shared holidays with nodded along with speeches that essentially celebrated my marginalization. Jessica took the microphone, next her voice honey-sweet with malicious undertones. "You know, when we started this journey, some people said we were moving too fast, changing too much. Some people thought the old ways were good enough." She paused dramatically, and I swear she glanced directly toward my house. But real leadership means making tough decisions even when they're not popular with everyone. The crowd laughed appreciatively, and I felt my hands clench into fists. They were essentially holding a victory party to celebrate driving me out of my own neighborhood, and they'd convinced dozens of good people that this was somehow admirable progress. Then came the part that crossed every line of human decency. Jessica announced a lighthearted activity where community members could share funny stories about resistance to positive change, and what followed was essentially a public roasting session with neighbors encouraged to make jokes about people who think the Constitution still matters in HOA governance, and residents who believe experience is more important than education. The jokes weren't directly about me, but everyone knew exactly who they were targeting. Comments about people who can't adapt to modern technology and neighbors who think yesterday's solutions work for tomorrow's problems generated waves of laughter from an audience that seemed to have forgotten every principle of basic human respect. Standing at my window, watching people I'd considered friends participate in this orchestrated humiliation, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my darkest days as a young prosecutor facing corrupt judges and bought politicians. I was alone, outgunned, and facing opponents who believed their power made them invulnerable. But while Brandon and Jessica were busy celebrating their apparent victory, I was putting the finishing touches on an investigation that would expose them for exactly what they were. Over the past 3 months, I'd been using every skill I'd developed in 30 years of federal prosecution work to build a case that would destroy their carefully constructed image of competent leadership. It had started with simple curiosity about their rapid implementation of expensive community improvements. New landscaping contracts, updated security systems, and facility upgrades had been approved and implemented with impressive speed. Too impressive, actually, for an organization that had previously required months of planning and multiple resident meetings for any significant expenditure. Using my legal background and some discreet inquiries to former colleagues who specialized in financial crimes, I discovered that Brandon and Jessica's efficient management style included several irregularities that would interest federal investigators. Contracts awarded without proper bidding processes, invoices for services that were never actually provided, and financial relationships between board members and vendors that violated every ethical guideline for nonprofit community organizations. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that their contempt for outdated procedures extended far beyond mere arrogance. They'd been systematically stealing from the community fund, using their authority to approve fraudulent expenses and divide the proceeds through a network of shell companies and kickback arrangements. By the time their celebration reached its peak, with Brandon announcing plans for even more ambitious improvements funded by special assessments on all residents, I was ready to make my move. I'd coordinated with federal agents, gathered irrefutable documentation, and prepared for the kind of legal reckoning that would remind everyone why experience and patience often triumph over arrogance and haste. As the evening wound down and neighbors began heading home, many of them passed by my house with expressions ranging from guilty discomfort to open hostility. Mrs. Patterson, my former ally on the old board, actually crossed the street to avoid walking directly in front of my property. The isolation was complete exactly as Brandon and Jessica had planned. They'd successfully convinced an entire community that I was the problem, the obstacle standing between Riverside Hills and its bright modern future. In their minds, they'd won a total victory. What they didn't realize was that their celebration marked not the end of my influence, but the beginning of their reckoning. Tomorrow morning, federal agents would arrive to begin an investigation that would reveal the true cost of their efficient leadership. The same neighbors who'd laughed at jokes about outdated thinking would learn that some old-fashioned concepts like accountability and legal compliance never go out of style. Sometimes the most satisfying victories come not from immediate retaliation, but from patient preparation and perfect timing. Brandon and Jessica were about to discover that underestimating a retired federal prosecutor was the kind of mistake that destroyed careers, reputations, and futures. The morning of August 15th started like any other summer day in Phoenix, with temperatures already climbing toward triple digits by 9 a.m. I was in my kitchen preparing coffee when I heard the distinctive sound of multiple vehicles pulling up to our community's main gate. Through my front window, I could see a convoy that made my prosecutor heart sing with anticipation. 4 unmarked federal vehicles, 2 Phoenix Police Department cars, and an FBI mobile command unit arranged themselves in a formation that every criminal in America learns to recognize and fear. I watched Agent Sarah Martinez, whom I'd worked with on dozens of federal cases during my career, step out of the lead vehicle with the same crisp professionalism I remembered from our days prosecuting organized crime figures. Across the street, Brandon was loading his BMW with golf clubs, apparently planning a leisurely Saturday morning on the course. The sound of car doors slamming in rapid succession made him freeze his casual weekend routine, suddenly interrupted by the unmistakable presence of federal law enforcement. I walked calmly out to my front porch, straightened my shoulders, and prepared to remind my neighbors exactly who Sadie Thomson really was. For 3 months, I'd endured their condescension, their mockery, and their systematic attempts to drive me from my own home. Today, they were going to learn why 30 years as a federal prosecutor had taught me that patience and preparation always defeat arrogance and corruption. Agent Martinez approached my property line with the measured stride of someone who'd conducted hundreds of arrests. "Mrs. Thomson," she called out formally, "thank you for your cooperation in this investigation. We're ready to proceed." The words carried across the quiet morning air like thunder. Brandon's golf clubs clattered to his driveway as he processed what he was hearing. Jessica, who'd been watering plants on her front porch, in a scene of calculated domestic perfection, let her hose drop from suddenly nerveless fingers. I stepped down from my porch and walked toward Agent Martinez with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades working alongside federal law enforcement. "Agent Martinez, I'm glad you could respond so quickly. As I outlined in my report, we're dealing with systematic embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud a homeowners association." The transformation in neighborhood dynamics was instantaneous and dramatic. Residents who'd been enjoying their quiet Saturday morning routines suddenly found themselves in the middle of a federal crime scene. The same neighbors who'd dismissed me as a confused old lady watched in stunned silence as I discussed criminal charges with FBI agents like a colleague rather than a victim. Brandon attempted to project his usual confident leadership persona as he approached our group. "Excuse me, officers, but I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. I'm Brandon Hartwell, president of the Riverside Hills Homeowners Association. If there's some issue with community management, I'm sure we can resolve it quickly." Agent Martinez turned to face him with the expression every federal agent masters professional neutrality that somehow manages to convey the weight of impending justice. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm Special Agent Martinez with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. You're under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement of community funds, and conspiracy to commit fraud." The Miranda warning that followed was read in the same steady professional tone I'd heard hundreds of times during my career. Watching Brandon's face cycle through disbelief, panic, and desperate calculation reminded me why I'd chosen prosecution over defense work. Criminals always believed they were smarter than the system until the moment handcuffs clicked around their wrists. Jessica tried to run. It was a brief, undignified sprint toward the back of her property that ended when 2 additional agents positioned specifically to prevent escape attempts intercepted her before she reached her rear gate. Her arrest was equally systematic and professional, conducted with the efficiency that comes from careful planning and coordination. As both suspects were processed and placed in separate federal vehicles, I took the opportunity to address the growing crowd of shocked neighbors. For those of you who might be wondering what's happening here, let me explain. I am Sadie Thomson, retired federal prosecutor with 30 years of experience investigating financial crimes. For the past 3 months, while you were attending celebration parties and laughing at jokes about outdated thinking, I've been conducting a federal investigation into systematic theft from our community fund. The silence was absolute. Faces that had shown contempt, dismissal, and amusement now reflected horror, embarrassment, and dawning comprehension. Mrs. Patterson, who'd crossed the street to avoid me just yesterday, looked like she might faint. I continued with the same measured tone I'd once used to address juries in federal courtrooms. Brandon Hartwell and Jessica Manning have stolen approximately $180,000 from our community through fraudulent contracts, fake invoices, and kickback arrangements with shell companies they established specifically to defraud homeowners associations. Agent Martinez nodded toward the thick folder of documentation I handed her. Mrs. Thompson's investigation was exemplary, she announced to the crowd. Her evidence includes bank records, recorded conversations, email correspondence, and financial analysis that clearly establishes a pattern of systematic fraud spanning nearly 2 years. This case will serve as a model for other HOA fraud investigations nationwide. The professional validation felt better than any personal vindication could have. Here was proof delivered by active federal agents that my skills hadn't diminished with age, that my experience remained valuable, and that my instincts about Brandon and Jessica's criminal behavior had been absolutely correct. As the federal convoy prepared to depart with their prisoners, neighbors began approaching me with expressions of shock, shame, and desperate apology. The same people who'd nodded approvingly when I was publicly humiliated now wanted to explain that they'd never really supported the board's treatment of longtime residents. But the most satisfying moment came when Mrs. Patterson finally found the courage to speak. "Sadie, I am so deeply sorry. We should have listened to you from the beginning. We should have trusted your experience instead of being swept up in their promises of modernization." I looked around at faces I'd known for decades, people who'd forgotten that respect and decency matter more than efficiency and progress. "The evidence will show that Brandon and Jessica weren't just stealing money," I said quietly. "They were stealing our sense of community, turning neighbors against each other, and using age discrimination to distract from their criminal activities." As the crowd slowly dispersed, residents returning to homes they'd now have to reassess without the leadership they'd trusted, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not vindication or triumph, but the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. Justice had been served through proper channels, using legal procedures and professional competence rather than personal retaliation. The investigation wasn't over, of course. Federal cases require months of preparation before trial, and there would be community meetings to reorganize our HOA under ethical leadership. But the hardest part was finished. The criminals had been exposed, arrested, and removed from positions where they could hurt other people. Sometimes the most important victories aren't the ones that make you feel powerful. They're the ones that remind you why principles like justice, patience, and proper procedure matter more than personal satisfaction or immediate gratification. The weeks following Brandon and Jessica's arrest transformed Riverside Hills in ways none of us could have anticipated. Federal agents had seized all HOA financial records computers and documentation related to community management going back 3 years. What they discovered made headlines in the Phoenix Business Journal and sparked investigations into HOA fraud schemes across Arizona. The financial damage was staggering. Beyond the $180,000 in direct theft, Brandon and Jessica had committed the community to fraudulent contracts worth an additional $300,000. Projects that residents believed were legitimate improvements to property values were revealed to be elaborate schemes designed to generate kickback payments to shell companies controlled by our former board members. The mainstream media attention was relentless. Local television stations interviewed me about the investigation, framing the story as "Retired Prosecutor Exposes $1 Million HOA Fraud." The irony wasn't lost on me that the same age and experience Brandon and Jessica had mocked as irrelevant became the focal point of stories about their downfall. More importantly, the community fund money was recoverable. Federal prosecutors had frozen assets and traced the stolen funds through the network of fake companies and fraudulent accounts. Residents would eventually receive full restitution along with compensation for legal fees and financial damages caused by the fraud scheme. But the psychological recovery took longer than the financial recovery. In emergency community meetings held after the arrests, longtime residents and newer families struggled to rebuild trust that had been systematically destroyed by Brandon and Jessica's manipulation tactics. The divide between old guard and progressive residents had been artificially created to distract from criminal activity, but the hurt feelings and damaged relationships were real. I found myself in the unexpected position of community mediator, helping neighbors understand how they'd been manipulated and encouraging forgiveness for those who'd participated in the systematic marginalization of older residents. My legal experience proved valuable in explaining how con artists use divisive rhetoric to control their victims and prevent unified resistance to their schemes. The new HOA board, elected through proper procedures with full community participation, implemented changes that balanced modernization with respect for established residents. Garden guidelines were revised to protect memorial plantings and traditional landscaping while encouraging water conservation. Paint requirements became suggestions rather than mandates, and all major decisions required community forums where every resident's voice would be heard respectfully. Most gratifying was watching younger families discover the value of institutional memory and community wisdom. Parents who'd dismissed longtime residents as obstacles to progress began seeking advice about everything from local schools to neighborhood history. Children who'd been taught to avoid that old lady's house started visiting to hear stories about Riverside Hills in earlier decades. My restored rose garden became a symbol of community healing. Neighbors volunteered to help replant varieties that matched Robert's original design, and the project evolved into a memorial garden honoring all residents who'd contributed to our neighborhood's character over the years. Brandon's sterile desert landscaping requirements were replaced with guidelines that celebrated diverse gardening styles and personal expression. The federal trial, when it finally occurred, provided closure for everyone who'd been affected by the fraud scheme. Brandon received 14 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to charges that included wire fraud, money laundering, and civil rights violations. Jessica's sentence was 12 years reduced slightly because of her cooperation with investigators tracking similar schemes in other communities. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the transformation in how community leadership functioned. The new board included residents of all ages, backgrounds, and perspectives. Meetings became genuine forums for discussion rather than venues for predetermined announcements. Decisions were made through consensus building rather than executive mandate. I accepted a position as community legal advisor, helping ensure that all future HOA actions complied with state law and federal regulations. My experience proved invaluable in reviewing contracts, evaluating proposals, and protecting residents from the kind of manipulation we'd endured under Brandon and Jessica's leadership. The story attracted attention from HOA reform advocates nationwide. I began consulting with other communities dealing with similar problems, helping residents recognize warning signs of financial fraud and providing guidance on proper oversight procedures. My retirement had evolved into a new career focused on protecting homeowners from predatory board members and fraudulent management companies. Most importantly, Riverside Hills became a model for inclusive community governance. Residents learned that progress and tradition could coexist, that efficiency didn't require dismissing experience, and that the strongest communities were those that valued every member's contributions regardless of age or background. The neighborhood children who'd once been hurried past my house as if I carried some contagious obsolescence began stopping by after school to help with garden maintenance and hear stories about their community's history. Teaching them about civic responsibility and community involvement reminded me why I'd chosen public service as a career path decades earlier. Watching our community heal and grow stronger felt better than any courtroom victory I'd achieved as a prosecutor. We'd not only survived an attack on our values and our financial security, we'd emerged with better systems, stronger relationships, and renewed commitment to the principles that make neighborhoods into true communities. 6 months later, I sit in my restored memorial garden, watching the sun set over the Santa Mountains, reflecting on a journey that began with humiliation and ended with redemption. The roses Robert planted 23 years ago bloom again in carefully tended beds, tended not just by me, but by neighbors who've learned to value tradition alongside progress. The healing process wasn't immediate or simple. Communities, like individuals, need time to recover from systematic betrayal and manipulation. But watching families of all ages work together to rebuild trust and cooperation reminded me why I dedicated my career to public service. Justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing, it's about creating conditions where decent people can thrive together. Some might say I should feel bitter about those months of isolation, mockery, and deliberate cruelty. The personal attacks on my age competence and relevance were designed to cause lasting psychological damage. Brandon and Jessica succeeded in turning neighbors against each other and creating divisions that took months to heal completely. But bitterness serves no constructive purpose. What happened to me wasn't really about age discrimination, though that was the weapon they chose. It was about power-hungry individuals who believed they could manipulate good people into abandoning their principles and values. The same tactics work regardless of whether the targets are seniors, minorities, immigrants, or any group that can be characterized as other or outdated. The real lesson isn't that I was strong enough to fight back successfully. It's that communities are strongest when they refuse to be divided by manipulative leaders who profit from conflict and confusion. Brandon and Jessica's power came not from their competence or vision, but from their ability to make neighbors stop trusting each other long enough to steal everything of value. My experience taught me something I hadn't fully understood during my prosecution career. Legal victories are important, but they're not sufficient. Building just communities requires ongoing commitment to treating all members with dignity and respect, regardless of their age, background, or perspective. The courtroom can address criminal behavior, but healing requires much more personal and sustained effort. The young families who once dismissed me as irrelevant have become some of my closest friends. They've learned that experience isn't the enemy of innovation. It's the foundation that makes positive change possible. Their children call me Grandma Sadie now, and I've become the community grandmother I never had the chance to be with Robert's passing. My consulting work with other HOA communities has shown me that Riverside Hills wasn't unique. Across the country, retirement communities and established neighborhoods face similar challenges from individuals who use modernization rhetoric to justify discriminatory treatment and financial exploitation. The patterns are remarkably consistent, suggesting that what we experienced was part of a broader problem in community governance. But I've also seen communities successfully resist these manipulation tactics by maintaining strong oversight systems and inclusive decision-making processes. When residents insist on transparency, legal compliance, and respectful treatment for all members, it becomes much harder for predatory leaders to establish the control they need to engage in systematic fraud. Perhaps the most important outcome is that Riverside Hills now serves as a model for other communities dealing with similar challenges. We've proven that progress and tradition can coexist, that efficiency doesn't require abandoning fairness, and that the strongest neighborhoods are those that value every resident's contributions. The children playing in our common areas today will grow up understanding that community leadership is a responsibility, not an opportunity for personal gain. They'll know that proper procedures exist to protect everyone's interests, not to create bureaucratic obstacles. Most importantly, they'll understand that treating people with respect isn't outdated, thinking it's the foundation of everything worth preserving about American community life. As darkness settles over Riverside Hills, I can hear families gathering for dinner, children playing in front yards, and neighbors calling friendly greetings across garden fences. These ordinary sounds of community life represent everything Brandon and Jessica tried to destroy for their personal profit. They failed because they underestimated not just me, but the fundamental decency of people who'd chosen to build lives together in this place. Once the manipulation tactics were exposed and the financial crimes were revealed, our neighbors remembered who they really were and what kind of community they wanted to create. Tonight, Mrs. Patterson will stop by with leftover cookies from her granddaughter's visit. The Martinez family next door will share vegetables from their garden. Young Tyler from Oak Street will deliver the evening newspaper he started as a small business venture, always taking time to update me on his school projects and baseball team progress. These simple interactions represent the victory that matters most. Not the criminal convictions or financial restitution, important as those were, but the restoration of a community where people care for each other across generational lines and treat differences of opinion as opportunities for learning rather than reasons for conflict. The question I'm most often asked during my consulting work is how to identify predatory leaders before they gain control of community organizations. My answer is always the same. Watch how they treat people who can't fight back immediately, how they respond to questions about their authority, and whether they try to divide residents into competing factions instead of building consensus around shared values. But the more important question is how to build communities strong enough to resist manipulation in the first place. That requires ongoing commitment from all residents to stay engaged, ask hard questions, and insist that leadership serve the community rather than personal ambition. As I prepare to go inside for the evening, I notice young Sarah Chen practicing violin on her family's front porch while her grandmother tends their flower garden. 3 generations working together in harmony, each contributing something valuable to their shared home. This is what Brandon and Jessica tried to destroy, and this is what we succeeded in preserving. Have you ever been underestimated because of your age or experience? Let me know in the comments how you handled the situation, and don't forget to hit the like button. If you believe that wisdom and patience can triumph over arrogance and corruption. Subscribe for more stories about standing up for what's right, and share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that justice sometimes takes time, but it always arrives for those who never stop fighting for it. Remember that respect isn't something that goes out of style, and experience isn't a liability. It's a gift that keeps giving when we have the courage to use it. Thank you for listening to my story, and may you always find the strength to stand up for your community and the people you love.